Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As was mentioned, my name is Thomas Upchurch. I'm the director of Wired Consulting, which is the consulting division of Wired magazine, based in London in the UK. And for this next session, we're going to be exploring a really important but very tricky subject, which is how to introduce ethical thinking into the design of programs and digital decision-making systems. And we have a fantastic panel of experts to help us do this, from central government, from private sector, and from civil society. But just before I introduce you to them, I actually want to find out how ethical our audience is, because I think it's always important to know your audience. So I'm sure there's a lot of designers and developers in the audience. The first question I want to ask you is, how many of you in this audience use ethical guidelines in the design of your products and systems? Could you please raise your hand if you use ethical guidelines? Okay, there's a few hands raised. It's not too unethical an audience. This second question, you have to be pretty brave to answer this in public. How many of you think that the systems or the programs you design are unethical in nature? There's always one normally, but no, there's no. Okay, that's great. We're dealing with nice people here. Finally, probably the most important question is, how many of you would like to implement ethical thinking in the way that you design your systems more and more? Excellent, okay. It's a nice audience, excellent, great. So on that note, we can introduce you to your panel. On my right, we have Dr.Rumman Chowdhury, who's the head of responsible AI at Accenture. We then have Dr. Salma Abbasi, who is the CEO and founder of eWorldwide Group, a consultancy that works in the developing world, many parts around the world, implementing ethical systems. We also have Dr. Dorothea Von Wichert-Nick, who is the CEO of, I hope that was the right pronunciation, CEO and founder of etventure. And finally, certainly not least, we have Minister Margarethe Schramböck, who is the Federal Minister of Digital and Business Affairs at the Austrian government. So thank you all so much for being here with us here today. So I think to kick this off, just to give people a bit of a background on the ethical issues around ethical digital systems, there's been a lot of talk at the moment, certainly in the media, about creating ethical AI, responsible AI. Rumman, would you mind just giving people an idea of what we actually really mean by ethical AI?
And that's an excellent question. Thank you, Tom. It's a tough one to answer because even philosophers, ethicists, it's an entire field of people who have studied this for thousands of years, right? Since humankind has been able to write anything down, we've had some sort of history of people trying to understand ethics and humanity. So this is not to say that there is one code of ethics, even that we can create one code of ethics, but how might we create our technology and our digital system such that they improve society and they don't cause undue harm? And if there is harm that's created, how might we mitigate it? So in my world of responsible ethical AI, we use the acronym FATE: Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, Explainability.
And so fairness seems to be one of the dominant narratives there.
Yeah, it is. And I think we've seen some examples of things that have happened that we as a society have agreed was unfair. And that's led to an entire field of discussion simply about the concept of fairness, absolutely.
And so moving from that, if we have to think about some of the repercussions that poorly designed systems are having, Salma, would you mind giving us an overview of some of those repercussions that we're facing?
I think that one of the most important things that it's having as technology progresses with artificial intelligence is missing the human factor and the consideration in society in general. So when we design, as a former coder myself, I think the world has become very complicated within every realm of our life, whether we're looking for a job and a bias is automatically, unintentionally built into a system, we find that we're not actually selected for a role. So there's changes that are happening, but it seems to me that as we integrate more AI systems into our business operations and government systems, there's a discrimination and a gap building between those that fit the criteria that is unintentionally or intentionally built in, and it's creating a group of marginalized young people in societies. So I think that when we talk later on the parameters that need to be put in place, it's to realize the segregation of society that is happening through AI, whether it's a business or it's a community. Those kind of things are having huge issues and complications because they're not being recognized until it actually becomes an issue.
So it requires more of a preemptive approach and strategy there. Just to perhaps elaborate a little bit on some of the risks, just for those who may not be watching the space as much. Obviously, there was quite a popular book that came out 2 years ago by a lady called Cathy O'Neill, who wrote this book called Weapons of Mass Destruction, which is by far the best title for any book I've ever heard in a long time. And she kind of accounted for the way that unfair, bias-ridden systems were accentuating inequalities in the judiciary, in the education system, in the employment and hiring space as well. Are there any areas at the moment where you're particularly concerned or see particular risks?
Well, I think that's a very good question. It's a bit sensitive, but I think we should get into it. When we talk about national security, we work in the security space as well as part of development. What happens is certain groups are marginalized and identified to be of high risk, and it's through an algorithm that is created, and people don't actually understand there's a human side of things that need to be considered, and all of our fingers aren't equal. So all the parameters that we actually sit in a lab or in a university and program and create, when it actually gets implemented, and I'll give you an example, when something gets implemented by the police to try and ensure that we identify a high-risk community or a group of people that need to be separated or further, let's say, analyzed and observed, you miss the actual high-risk group because the parameters that were in place are the incorrect ones. And then what happens is that you've then created a cascade effect because a group that wasn't initially hostile then becomes hostile. So from a policing context or national security, governments have to be very careful to address the issues of monitoring criminals, monitoring, let's say, predators, and then monitoring what we call terrorists. And in Europe, obviously, it's a very big issue. All of us travel around the world, and within Europe, we seem to have an incident every couple of months. But so I understand the need for us to be careful and cautious, but it's not with machines, AI or machine learning that you can put these programs into place. It's important that the environmental factors and the social, cultural context and the ethics that we're talking about was much research is in that space, but the societal issues need to be considered and the consequences. I'm a great believer of mapping. When, as designers and developers, if we map what we're trying to do and all of the framework that comes out of it, which could be unintentional consequences. Obviously, those that we didn't intend won't be mapped out that easily, but when we have consultations with stakeholders from other sectors, it's amazing how you have these aha moments that then make a very resilient, robust design that can then be implemented.
Thank you. And Dorothea, perhaps just to elaborate a little bit on that, we've got a lot of designers and developers in the audience. What kind of practical steps can they take to design things in a more ethical manner?
We are designing business models for our clients. And at the heart of designing business models is usually a platform or a technical platform. So programmers do play a big role for us. And I think the key question is how can we make the whole system ethical? Because it's in the end, the program and the coder is sitting at the end and taking what's coming in. So it's not only his discussion. He or she can take decisions on a micro level. How can I make sure that the data is not leaking out? How can I make sure that there is no harmful access to the system? These are decisions he can take, but the whole design of the system, design of a business model, which is the key driver for being ethical or not ethical, has to be put in a bigger perspective, has to be discussed in the company on a more societal level. I think that's a discussion we are currently missing. People have been very willing to give in data, to get access to more profiling, to be better served by the systems, and now with the Facebook scandals and so, I probably see themselves in a situation where they say, wow, it was too much data and I don't know how to deal with that. I think we have to find that balance in society.
Absolutely, and we will get into the way that organizations and governments and regulators need to play a role in this. But just quickly coming back to one of the problems I think a lot of, certainly data scientists, but I imagine developers as well face, is that it seems to be an inherent conflict between achieving fairness on the one side and the actual efficiency or accuracy of a given system. In some cases, the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes that we want to get rid of, come true in the data or are true in the data. how do data scientists get around that conflict between fairness and efficiency? I'm going to give this really hard one to Rumman. Sorry.
That's fine. I'm happy. That's pretty much my job.
Okay.
So it may be hard, but that's what Accenture pays me the money to do. I would start by even challenging the premise. It is not. It depends on what you mean by efficiency, right? There are many ways one may define accuracy and efficiency. Can I really say I have created the most efficient system if one entire subgroup of my system is being poorly served? And let's take it away from, let's say, race or gender, et cetera, but let's say I have many different types of clients who purchase my product and use my products, and I say that one group is getting 100% or 99% accuracy, and one group only gets 60% accuracy. Can I really say that I have an accurate product? You would say no, right? That is exactly how facial recognition works. Facial recognition, some of the most popularly used algorithms and systems are 99% accurate for white male faces and 68% accurate for darker black female faces. Do we really say that's an accurate model then, just because it's globally accurate? So, but yes, there is quantitative model efficiency that may decrease as a result of implementing fairness metrics. But the good thing about that is accuracy is measurable, and one can see what the trade-off is. And so we're actually developing a system at Accenture to test fairness of data and algorithms, and even to try to fix that. And I say fairness defined in a very, very specific way as equal outcomes for different subgroups, so equalized impact. But we also do offer that fairness accuracy trade-off. What I would say is if you're trying to put your algorithm and your data through this fairness tool and you're finding significant decreases in accuracy, as the data scientist by background, I would say start with a new model, start all over again.
And quickly getting into, Cathy O'Neill again mentioned the development of certain tools like an ethical matrix, in which would map out the different stakeholders which designers could use. The importance of things that's like quite basic things like feedback data, making sure that you have an open loop system. Would you mind just giving a little bit more on that, just for them?
So ethicscanvas.org, it's free to use. It was originally designed for data projects more broadly. You can easily use it for data science and AI projects. Another exercise I actually do at Accenture, you had asked earlier about this concept of where in the design process or where in your product process different considerations have to come. I think it's a common misconception that things like ethics and regulations are, will hinder a process. We are in the process of developing what I call, agile ethical frameworks that go along with our way of agile development, so that in your product life cycle, there are certain stops you make to make ethical considerations, identifying the right kinds of parties. But what has to happen up front is you have to do your homework. You have to create a regulatory framework inside your company. This is the accountability, transparency, explainability. So you have to know what your framework is in your company, and then you just, literally go through the motions and you do the work that's required.
Excellent. And that kind of leads us quite nicely on to the kind of government level and the regulatory level. In the UK, we are setting up our own UK Centre for Data and Ethics. There's a number of similar initiatives around the world, and there've even been a call for a Hippocratic oath for data scientists and other kinds of digital designers. Minister Schramböck, I just wanted to know what you felt about some of these initiatives from a policy perspective. Is it something that the Austrian government's looking at and is interested in?
Yeah, thank you. So first, I'm very happy to be here in your company, also in the company of so many programmers, of coders, and this is very important for us. For the first time, we have a ministry, and it's not so long ago that I was in the IT industry, and we have a ministry now called Digitalisation and Economic Affairs. So this is one step into the right direction, and we should take care of also these topics, of course, and have a look at it from the government side, because I think it's a little bit unfair to put all the burden onto the programmer himself or herself. First, we have different layers in between. We have the company's responsibilities. So I was a CEO for quite some time, actually for many years. So it is also a responsibility of the companies to take care of it, to build a framework. And it's a responsibility of countries and I would say on the European Union. In Europe, I would say this is more something we need to do together in the European Union, and we are heading up for the European Council, so we're head of the European Council soon, starting in July. This is coming up very quickly, and we will take this as one, or I will take this as one of our topics also on board. The European Commission is also working on it, so until the end of 2018, I understood, they're working on a concept. How should these ethical standards be defined? And I hope they are working closely together with the community so that we are not building something which is rigid. As you said, it needs to be agile. It needs to be like we're working today in rapid prototyping and very flexible ways of developing and working. And I hope this is not very static, because there I will be a voice, because I'm a voice. When I started to go in politics, I'm a voice in the European Union. We tend to be very rigid in the European Union and to over-regulate. So what I do not want, and this will be very clear in the 6 months that we are responsible, that I will have a voice for more deregulation and not over-regulation. So my fear a little bit in this area is that we as politicians or politics think we can do everything and we can regulate, and we can do it the best way. And here we really need to be very careful on that and not overdo it. Why? Because looking at the US, or looking at Asia, we have other ethical standards, not in the US, but in southern Asian countries. And if we look at the social credit system, for example, which I have to reject. I was just recently in China. I'm very impressed by the positive, the speed, and the let's say, the willingness to go ahead and to accept new technologies. But on the other hand, we have ethical standards in Europe, and security and data protection and consumer protection, these standards we want to keep. So we need to find a middle way in between, not to hold a whole industry back in Europe, which we did a little bit in the past. So all consumer innovation is coming from the US, so we missed a little bit the B2C train. We need to be very successful on the B2B in Europe and find a middle way, not to overdo it.
Is there an argument to say, obviously, I think a lot of business owners would, when they hear the word ethics, they would think, yes, that's very nice, but actually, when it comes down to commercial imperatives and business objectives, I need to stay focused on those objectives. Is there an argument to say that there is a competitive advantage in positioning your business around ethics? And I think that probably an interesting example here today could be the Project Maven controversy for Google. Obviously, Google is still an incredibly, the world's top organization. Everyone still wants to work there to a point. However, it has raised an interesting idea that very talented people with brains want to work and want to know what they're working towards. Would you say that there's kind of an interesting competitive advantage in being ethical?
Yes, indeed, definitely. This is very important also. If we look at the companies which are successful, we also see that companies who have a diverse workforce, also a diverse supervisory board, for example. This means not only women inside, but young people inside, elder people inside, international, coming from different cultures, different companies. They have higher success, they're more successful, they have even higher growth in sales. So I think it's very short-sighted if a CEO or a government is deciding, saying, okay, it doesn't matter, especially in companies, and because productivity and efficiency always follows in the long run these ethical standards and also the culture a company has. I'm very convinced that you're all here, you want to work for companies which you see the why, you find the answer to the why. We want to change something in the world. This is why I'm doing this job. I was in business before. I was never a politician. So when I was asked, I said, yes, let's do it. I can change maybe things which I always wanted to change. And if companies also understand that this is what they have to do, and to integrate this, otherwise their biggest talents will leave.
Can I actually add to that as well? And I think that there's a shift happening, this, beyond what we're talking about here today about ethics and AI, there is a shift happening towards a more conscious capitalism. And, I live in Silicon Valley. I see this arc happen so much, where people move to Silicon Valley, they get their coveted Google, Facebook, Apple job, etc. They reach this level, and then they say, and now what? I've made more money than I know what to do. I've had this amazing career. And literally every single person starts to move into philanthropy. And this is, let's say Tristan Harris, this is like a lot of folks where they realize that there has to be something more than just making money. And this is actually a shift that we're seeing in companies as well. We had Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. Mind you, this is a multi-billion-dollar company that works on helping rich companies get richer. This guy is the poster child for Wall Street. Why is he writing a letter saying that companies need to be doing more than just making the bottom line happen? Why is he saying that companies need to have a social position and do good? Now, one can debate whether or not BlackRock itself is meeting the standards that he's putting forth in this letter, but just the signal that letter sends is so critical and important. And we're seeing this voice coming up from millennials and from Gen Z saying, it's not enough just to say, I've checked off the regulatory boxes and I'm not breaking any laws. We're holding companies to a higher moral standard. And so to your question, I think it is actually not just good business practice, but better business practice. When you think about industries such as sustainability and organics, which have built themselves as highly profitable industries around concepts of a common good, whether it's saving the planet, good animal husbandry, whatever it is, there's an entire industry, a very profitable one, built around these concepts. So why can't we and why shouldn't we do it for everything else?
Yeah, I actually can just support that. I mean, we're a young company, just 4 years old, with 200 people, and most of our employees, which are diverse team, are coming from startups. And they come to us because values do play a role, and because we say we want to generate values, not just for our clients, but also for the society. So we have a lot of discussions around that, and projects that are on the edge get a strong discussion, but this is really keeping a very vibrant development area where people can really, they go to the edges to find the right models, to push things forward, to create something that is really good in their way, and that's really driving the business. And I'm absolutely convinced that this is providing a clear advantage compared to a lot of firms where it doesn't play a role. You get different people, more creative.
And so if we could perhaps, sorry Salma, did you want to make
I was going to add, especially to Rumman's point, I'm from the Silicon Valley. In 1980 I started coding. Steve Wozniak was here on the first day, so I'm one of his colleagues, or his age group, and grew through the ranks, Senior Vice President, Lucent Technologies. I noticed your Alcatel background. And then I retired. I took my money and I said, what next? I went to Dubai, went on holiday and opened eWorldwide 18 years ago. And touch wood, we haven't looked back. We are a development company, social enterprise, and for the last 4 years we've been working, well, we've worked with governments on the SDGs and God knows what, but most importantly, over the last 3 years, we've been working with accelerators, startups, incubators. Obviously, as a technologist, I want to push technology. A couple of years ago, I did my PhD back in ICT for development because I saw there was a gap somewhere. And what we've done now, last year, we just designed a program, launched it in January in Nigeria, actually, and Ghana soon. It's called Right Skilling. So as a techie, one of the most important things that I want us to consider in the future is that technology is easy for us, but what's missing is what used to happen decades ago, which is the study of humanities, bringing in social responsibility, civic thinking, so that we can have our technology, but we develop the personality and the social civic responsibility in the minds of the young and the engineers. And on the other side, we have innovation, AI, artificial intelligence. And then crossing that, you've got the vocational, you've got the enterprises and startups. When we put all of this together, we actually create opportunities for the whole population, no matter what their technology interest is. And as a differentiator, when you talk about companies, as the Minister said, you know, it is a differentiator. People want to work with you when you're doing good projects. And money comes. It's not an issue. It shouldn't be the driving force. But I'm an engineer, so I like to measure things. And as you've seen the change, companies like Unilever identify themselves as sustainability thinkers. They have a huge portfolio in sustainable development. We work with them on malnutrition in Africa. So I know what they're doing. But many other countries are going down that line, and you say, I want to work with them. We're bringing technology into agriculture because there's livelihood, prevention of malnutrition, all sorts of things we can do as coders and developers that we're interested in. Join those companies. And then you were asking me before, if you measure these things, it becomes a differentiator. Used to be CSR. How many millions do we spend on social responsibility initiatives? Then it changed to now sustainability, now green, which companies are green. So we put another one, fourth one, and we call it ethics. Where is the ethics of what you do as a company? What are the negative impacts of what you do? And the question of who's responsible, we are all responsible for what we do. We don't need any big brother to come and tell us that this is wrong. We know what's wrong.
Well, on that wonderful point, I have been told that we should be opening up for questions from the audience. So do we have any questions? I believe you're supposed to text them through to the system, but I just wanted to make sure.
There you go.
Oh, we have one. Excellent. Okay. Do I have to read out all of them? What about the rude ones? No? Okay. Ethics is not, I'm just going to read these out. Okay, so ethics is not an accurate field, but heavily depends on culture. Is it even possible to implement systems that do not replicate the problems of our society?
I can take that one. And you are absolutely correct. So ethics does reflect culture. And I was just in Shanghai, and the entire gist of my talk, well, I had two talks, one to explain the ethical imperative and how it relates to good business, but the second one was about how there was an Eastern narrative missing. So I was just at the UN AI for Good Summit, and if you've heard of the Leverhulme Center, the Center for Future Intelligence, one of the projects that they are embarking on, led by Dr. Kanta Dehal, is called Decolonizing AI, and it's about getting these narratives. You're absolutely correct. Ethics is culturally dependent. So I think so, to the second part of the question about implementing systems that don't replicate the problems of society, it's not about creating a standalone AI that can govern itself and manage itself. And I think, Salma, you mentioned it beautifully earlier, and it's about keeping the human in the loop, keeping human-centric AI. The purpose of, what does AI do, right? AI takes massive amounts of information and finds patterns. And it also, sort of self-adjusts by reading the information that it learns from information, right? That is what AI is good at, period. Let's not pretend it's good at any other things. So Dr. Fei-Fei Li had a really good example, a really good analogy. She said that AI plays excellent chess in a burning house. So, okay, great. Knowing that that is the limitation of AI, it can take massive amounts of information, give me patterns. That's something my brain could not do, your brain could not do. How do we use that to inform human beings to make better decisions? So, it's not about not replicating the problems. There are problems in our society that we've previously not been able to measure. And now we can, and we can find these patterns. So the question is, what do we do as human beings now that we're able to find and accurately measure these patterns of inequality?
Maybe I can add something to this, because I think it's a great opportunity which we have. Whenever we had these big shifts in technology development, there was something started with people, it's rethinking. And we are rethinking what we are doing and how we're doing it. I think we have lost this a little bit in the 80s or 70s maybe also, that we were not so much thinking about it because we didn't have this big step ahead in technology. Every time this big step in technological development is happening, we need to slow down a little bit and rethink. I think this is a big opportunity, because when I remember in the 80s, we didn't have these discussions. Yeah? So it has, something has changed also due to the young people and the next generations who are rethinking things, and therefore I think AI is helping us to reshape also how we are thinking and what we are thinking, and could help us to talk more about ethical topics and responsibility than it did in the past years. I feel that this is more, it's really a trigger to do this. So therefore I think it's good. And I'm also convinced that we can all solve these issues. We just need to take the time and the best people and have a lot of discussions and allow a lot of different positions, and then we can solve this topic. Because what I think is, and what I'm facing or what I'm seeing is a lot of fear. Yeah, not in this community. Yeah, because you are close to it. You have new jobs. We have just today had the great opportunity. There will be an investment in Austria of 1.6 billion of Infineon, and Infineon will start chip production again in Austria, in Europe. It's bringing back production into Europe, fully digitalized, giving 500 additional jobs, 500 in R&D. But this is a different type of community. We have a lot of people who have a lot of fear, and they hear this artificial intelligence about their job, and will my job still be there? And this is also a very ethical question. How do we deal with this? I just wanted to add this point.
I'd like to add to that. I think that's beautiful, perfectly said. If you look at the fear, because it's very important that we allow ourselves time for reflection. To me, the jobs, people look at AI and say, oh, I'm going to lose the job to automation. I'm going to lose the job, that number crunching that used to happen to the computer. It is not the case. The jobs change. The human factor will never be replaced. In fact, again, in the opening, artificial is there, the analysis is there, the intelligence comes from you, comes from human beings. It's I like the question is a good one. Ethics is not accurate, but it's not ethics alone. We discussed earlier about the parameters for gauging and measuring and guiding what should be in place, what kind of framework. It's what you consider the human factors, the environmental factors, and the emotional factors. Lovely example, I'm a chess player, but I would never play chess. If that fire alarm went off, I'd run and leave everything behind, but a computer doesn't know that. It's going to sit there until it burns down. So what we're doing now, and it's something, a work in progress, is designing and creating the framework through continuous consultation across borders, because I wanted to take into consideration the cultural nuances and differences, but it's what are the human factors, what are the social considerations, what are the environmental factors, and the emotional factors. Those have to be munched together and utilized for us as developers to think in, have we considered this metrics? And the more we do, nothing is ever perfect. It will continually improve because we will keep learning from the mistakes we make. That is critical, that we recognize that it's not perfect and no one country has the answer on what is ethical, as you said.
Absolutely. I'm going to quickly turn to some of these questions because we've got some really interesting ones coming through. I particularly like the latest one. Oh, and it just disappeared off the page. We'll go to the next one. So, should any decision with significant negative impact to individuals be done or supported by data-driven AI, e.g. by a state agency? So who would like to take that one on?
I think so. I'm a little fuzzy on what the question is asking.
I think they're trying to get at. I think they're trying to get at perhaps.
Yeah, maybe you need to help me a little bit with the question.
Well, yes, I'll try. So I think they're trying to get at the potential repressive nature of some data-driven technologies.
I see. I see. So I think this is going at the social credit score that you brought up earlier. And I agree with you. I have massive problems with that sort of thing. So there's a lot of things happening in government. So I will tell you, as somebody who works with government officials, I think you're probably on the more technical side of things. Frankly, most people in government, it's totally new to them. So when I'm at the table, like I will be at roundtable summits at the OECD, for example, et cetera, and everyone's trying to wrap their heads around what this technology exactly is. But we do have plenty of people coming to these individuals saying, oh, I can find terrorists for you. I can find, I can help you deploy your police force more accurately. It's something called predictive policing. And, frankly, a lot of legislators are not adequately equipped yet with the right kinds of information. And what plenty of people are trying to do is reach out to learn more. So the answer to your question is no. Frankly, it shouldn't be. But what I think needs to happen is the education of the public in order to identify and protest against these things, and the education of politicians by the tech industry, because it's our job to provide this information and guidance so that politicians can make more informed decisions.
I think what we want is also to, of course, that is true. The governments and also the law is somewhere lacking behind, because what we see at the moment, if we want to do changes, we need to do a lot of legal changes also. The main question is also first to increase knowledge among people in governments, local governments, regional governments, and country governments, that the knowledge increases. This is happening automatically, because at the moment we have a quite young government, and of course we are as a generation using it, and it's a little bit different to a generation who has not touched these topics at all. So this will get better or evolve over time, so we'll naturally get better first. But second, of course, we need to do a lot of education and inside the government areas. What are we using artificial intelligence for? My dream is that a government can be an innovator, can be very far ahead, has also the responsibility to be so, and to offer to startups and others an environment where things can be tried, and where first innovators and first steps are taken. So I think the role of government can change in this way by the raising of knowledge in the government. You're completely right on that.
There's, I'm going to go back to the questions in just a moment, but there's an interesting, we talked about regulatory models earlier, and there's an interesting initiative that happened in the UK where the financial regulator, the FCA, developed something called the Regulatory Sandbox. So what they did was they actually, you have that too? Okay, excellent. So
I wanted to take it to the European,
yes,
I looked at that.
It's a good idea, isn't it? So just for the audience, the Regulatory Sandbox is where you have the startup or the organization invited in to design their product with the regulator watching. And this way, you create a very different kind of relationship between the regulator and the organization. And the best thing is the regulator starts to understand the new products and technologies that are being used. And on the other side, the organization starts to understand the expectations of the regulation. So it's a much more collaborative approach to regulation, rather than the old-fashioned, here are some rules, and if you break them, we'll fine you kind of approach.
And I think this gets at the agile governance concept really beautifully. That is agile governance. It's iterating over what regulation should be while creating and learning, right? That's pretty much it.
It's still a long way to go, but during the EU Council presidency, we will take this. This is on my agenda. So it's artificial intelligence and industry to support the industry in Europe again, especially in this respect. And second, to have this, to start, at least, it's only 6 months, to start the idea of regulatory sandboxes, and how could we implement this and take this as a best practice.
And I think the key in finding the right way is to really get closer to that dilemma between collecting a lot of data and the state also wanting to have access to a lot of data when it comes to fearful situations. At the same time, giving the leeway, not having too much data protection. I think that's the dilemma we haven't yet solved in the discussion.
And I'll add one more to that. One is collecting the data, and the other is actually doing something with it. Exactly. So the issue comes with the execution of what happens with that data. Data is collected through AI, government gets it, but then what does government do with it? That's the challenge.
We'll quickly turn to, I think we have time for 2 more questions. So is it a political failure that we rely on individual responsibility or company decisions to follow a not codified in law moral consensus?
I would love to know what a moral consensus is. Pretty much. No, I'm serious, actually.
Yeah,
we don't have moral consensus. That is the beauty of humanity, right? If we all were the same, thought the same, looked the same, acted the same, and thought all the same things were great, this would be a really boring world to live in. So by definition of the beauty of humanity, we don't have moral consensus.
Although in a democracy, you have a majority with who sometimes can have a dominant opinion.
Right. But then, as somebody who's American, I would say this is why our system, like current system aside, our political system as a whole was designed with checks and balances. Thomas Jefferson had a whole document he wrote on what he called the tyranny of the majority, this fear that just because everybody thinks something doesn't mean it's automatically the right thing to do. And, frankly, as people who are data scientists, developers, coders, maybe now it's cool, by the way, to be who we are, but most of us probably grew up in a time where it wasn't cool to watch Star Trek and want to play with computers, right? Because we didn't play football, it didn't join the cheerleading squad. So, you know, we may be dominant today, but we can remember a time when we weren't the majority. So who are we to say that that majoritarian consensus should rule, because we wouldn't be who we are today if it were for that.
And the other thing with codification is I think the world is moving so quickly, so fast, that it's really hard to keep pace in codification. So I think it's much more important to generate an environment where we ask the right questions and where we are critical to these developments and are in an ongoing discussion. Because it takes, I mean, how long does it take to get into a law? 7 years, 5 years usually? I mean, our world is developing so quickly. So I think it's a lot about educating people, starting with the kids, but other ones, to really question what they're doing and be more critical in using it, and thereby forcing that consensus.
Maybe let me add some points to the political failure. We are also learning. We are all learning how, because the development is so quickly in the last years, that also politicians are learning, society is learning, people are learning, schools are learning, everybody is learning how to deal with this. And of course, it's our responsibility to speed up a little bit, because it's not possible, which I found out that in Austria it takes we have a very good system, which is a dual educational system. I don't know the ones who are from other countries, if you know this, so that when you're a young person, you can work in a company and go to school at the same time. But it takes us 2 to 7 months to develop a new job of that kind. And so we shortened the period. I'm with my team on the way to shorten this period, because of course the market is requesting something completely different. Yeah, so therefore in September already we will launch a new job which can be learned, which is an e-commerce trader or the coder. There is no apprenticeship for coding at the moment in Austria. It's all hardware oriented. Yeah? We need to move on quickly, and yes, there can be failures. We can do things wrong, but we need to learn from it. And it's all of us who need to learn from it. It's the community as you are, then the politicians, then the CEOs, and the companies. I think it's a common responsibility we have. Failures can happen, but I would not quote it as a failure. There is no the failure, because humankind is always evolving and we are always constantly learning.
Well, on that very nice point, I think we have to end this session now. I hope all of you have taken a few ideas away in which you can implement more ethical and socially aware systems. If you'd like to give a big round of applause to our fantastic panelists, thank you.